Lake Superior, boundary waters, and also the wetlands of Lake Ontario. And I, at the time, worked with my mentor, Dr. Jim Meeker, and also Doug Wilcox, who then really were helpful in terms of mentoring my career. I then did a total 180 and I went across the ocean to study my master's degree in ecology at the Technical University of Munich. And there I was really interested in learning about peatland restoration. And it was a wonderful experience. I learned about how to measure greenhouse gases, for example. I then came back to the US to study at The Ohio State University with Dr. Virginie Bouchard at The Ohio State University. And there I studied plant community effects on wetland functions, and particularly depressional wetlands. And from there, I am now an associate professor of wetland science at the State University of New York at Brockport. And I just also want to give a shout out. In 2012, I became a member of the Society of Wetland Scientists Women in Wetlands section. And in 2018, I became a volunteer just helping out with this chapter, and quickly became really part of the main group. And now I am the chair-elect for that particular section.
I'm Ariana Sutton-Grier, and I am an ecologist, a wetland ecologist, also ecosystem ecologist, and biogeochemist. So I did my undergraduate training at Oregon State University, and it was while I was there studying environmental science that I took a class on wetland ecology. It was my senior year, and I just fell in love with these amazing systems that have so many important functions for wildlife and for people. And so, you know, I think I really fell for them when I realized that they were incredibly diverse, and that almost every species uses them at some point during their lifespan, at least the larger species, right? Because birds will use them at particular times, and mammals will come across them, and they're very important sources of water. They also provide important functions for people, like water filtration and carbon sequestration, and then amazing recreational opportunities. So I just fell for them, and I said, this is what I want to do in my graduate work. And there was one particular lecture on wetland restoration, and I was just hooked. I was like, oh my goodness, this is incredible. These systems, we degrade them and then they can still come back, depending on, obviously, you know, how you do the restoration. So I did my graduate work at Duke University after spending 2 years as a lab tech and lab manager. And I focused on how do we improve the functioning of our restored wetlands, looking particularly at nitrogen removal, because so many urban wetlands are polluted with nitrogen from runoff from cities and urban areas. And so that was my graduate work. I did a postdoc in Maryland at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Hence, you saw my post about one of my favorite wetlands in the world is Jug Bay, which was one of my research sites while I was a postdoc. And then I actually transitioned into a slightly different career path as a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow. And that took me to NOAA, where I was a fellow for 2 years in the National Marine Fisheries Service. And then I stayed at NOAA after my fellowship in the National Ocean Service. And so I was at NOAA for about 7 years, during which time I had a chance to really use my full ecosystem science and biogeochemistry background to inform a lot of different initiatives where science was really important to thinking about policy and decision making. It was there that I first really started to get into the role of coastal wetlands and other coastal ecosystems in terms of their important benefits for resilience of coastal habitats and communities. And then also the role of coastal wetlands in sequestering and storing carbon, called coastal blue carbon. So that was my time at NOAA. I have spent a little bit of time at the Maryland, DC chapter of the Nature Conservancy as the director of science there. And then I am most recently actually in the federal government, but I am also a visiting associate research professor at the University of Maryland. So that's a little bit about my background. More than happy to answer more questions, but let's get into the nitty gritties of wetlands here. So back to you, Abigail.
I love it. So wetlands have been intricately linked with humankind throughout the ages, whether they've been drained for development or used for other purposes. So for the people who are joining us today, drop in the chat a +1 or a thumbs up on your screen if you've eaten cranberries over the holidays this past year. And if you didn't know, cranberries may have come from what we call working wetlands, which can produce cranberries or rice. And so can both of you expand on the history and importance of wetlands? And so Ariana, can you go first, please?
Sure. So wetlands for the longest time were actually considered wastelands or wasted lands. There are some negative connotations when we use the word swamp in our popular culture. It's not usually meant to be a good thing. And so that comes from the fact that for literally hundreds of years, people sort of saw wetlands as this unusable wasted land that if you could only drain it, then you could use it to be productive, right? And you could actually build communities on it or farm it or whatever. And so in the US, we have lost basically at least 50% of our wetlands in most categories of wetlands. And in some cases, far above 50%. And that's because the value that wetlands provide to people was really not understood until more recently. And so when I talk about value, these are the benefits I was starting to bring up in my introduction, which is what got me so hooked about wetlands in general. But they are incredibly important as water filtration areas on our landscape, helping to provide clean water. Basically, wetlands are often in lower parts of the landscape, so water collects there. So they're important also for flood reduction. They're a good place to store water, and as that water is stored and slowly seeps into the ground or makes its way downstream, you get the opportunity for sediment to settle out and for biogeochemical reactions to occur. And all of that is helping to purify and clean that water. And then, as I mentioned, storing floodwaters as well. So we have incredible opportunities actually in this country, because we have lost a fair amount of our wetlands, to think about restoration in key areas. And we can target those restorations for particular benefits and services that communities and or wildlife might need. So there's a tremendous opportunity is how I like to see that loss of wetlands, because we can't go back in time, and we have already lost a fair amount of them. But we'll talk a little bit more about it, but basically policies like the Clean Water Act, and then also policies like the no net loss policy for wetlands, have been helpful in this country to slow the destruction of wetlands. I can't say we've completely halted it, but we have slowed it, and we have opportunities, as I mentioned, to do restoration and turn that around. So I'll stop there and let Rachel add.
Yes, well, Ariana has done a great job of summarizing this, and I just have a couple of things to add, and just to reiterate points. So as Ariana mentioned, we've lost over 50% of wetland area in the lower 48, the conterminous US. And that represents approximately 1 million acres that we're at a deficit of, basically from the 1780s, right? Amazingly, I just read this again, this figure, that loss of over basically over 100 million acres is the same as a loss of 60 acres an hour over 200 years. 60 acres an hour for all of those hours for 200 years. It's an amazing amount of change, right, that we experienced in the lower 48 in those 200 years. And so it's going to take a massive effort to restore that amount of area and to restore the functionality that had been there. And so in my research, I focus on how do we improve ecological restoration, particularly through looking at how do we change plant communities and what effects does that have on functionality, particularly in the Great Lakes. And a particular interest of mine is to scale up. Like, how do we think big about restoration? Because we have seen gains. The NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service Wetland Reserve Program, over the time of that program, was able to restore and protect about 5 million acres. Huge. DU, Ducks Unlimited, has said that they've been able to protect and restore 15 million acres in North America. And GLRI, which is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, has attributed their program starting in 2010 to 460,000 acres restored. So we've got a start, but there's, we can also think about, okay, there's a lot more area that have been lost that could potentially provide these functions to the greater area in the US.
I love that. So thank you so much for the historical context when it comes to wetlands, because many of us know of it, but don't at the same time. For this World Wetlands Day, which is actually inspiring because finally the UN has accepted this as an actual national day around the world. So congrats, this is our second year officially. And so the theme of this year is wetland action for people and nature, and it calls for urgent action to protect wetlands. So how has wetland science contributed to this theme and informed US policy to protect wetlands, at least over the last 50 years? And possibly, could you speak to the federal changes when it comes to the waters of the US, referred to as WOTUS? And are there ways for states or localities to protect wetlands?
Yes, so I'll start on this one. No small task. This is a big question, but I'm gonna put in my 2 cents here. I wanted to first talk about the Clean Water Act. This is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act in its current amended form. And I have 2 main points to make about how the Clean Water Act influences wetlands in the United States. First of all, the Clean Water Act's purpose is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. And as part of that act, the CWA then regulates the activities in and around wetlands that are covered under this nation's waters, or WOTUS, as we've already introduced, in an effort to discourage any unnecessary alteration or destruction of wetlands because they're environmentally vital and it is in the public interest to avoid harming those vital systems. So it's been really important, and it's been part of how we've basically maintained about the same level of wetland area since the 1980s, approximately. But the second point I want to make about the Clean Water Act and its relationship to wetlands is that the definition of WOTUS, of the nation's waters, has been in a state of flux for the last 50 years of the Clean Water Act, which then makes it very unclear what counts as a wetland under protection. And the fluctuations have been so great that in 2001, with the Supreme Court decision, what we call the Swansea decision, when isolated wetlands were no longer covered under the CWA, that represented between 20 and 60% of wetland area in the lower 48 that was no longer covered. And so these changes and what we determined to be covered under the waters of the US that are wetlands, because of that changing definition, and it changes with Supreme Court decisions, it changes with presidents of the United States. We go back and forth and it ping pongs. And, I think many of us are really looking for this to have a long-term permanent definition that really connects what we understand about wetlands and its importance to maintaining the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters to be codified into an act that's not going to ping pong all over the place.
I love that. So Ariana, could you expand a little bit more then when it comes to just outside of the Clean Water Act?
So I'm going to say that wetland science has progressed tremendously in the last 100 years, in the last 50 years, even just in the last decade. And that science continues to be absolutely key to our understanding of how these systems work, how they are connected on the landscape. So Rachel brought up this whole idea of isolated wetlands. I think more and more we're recognizing that there are probably actually very few wetlands that are fully isolated, right? They are connected via groundwater and or surface water to just, I mean, basically almost everyone we can find a connection now. And it is science that has been helping us to answer those questions. So science definitely in the wetland space informs our policies. Two examples from my own research and that those communities where this is having huge impacts, and not necessarily with specific legislation, but with the way federal agencies are thinking about and implementing programs, is in this coastal blue carbon space, where our understanding of the important role that wetlands can and do often play in carbon sequestration is actually leading to coastal wetlands and potentially other freshwater wetlands inland too, beginning to be part of conversations on climate mitigation. So again, I'm not pointing to like a specific legislative act like the Clean Water Act, but this is having big impacts in terms of discussions at the UNFCCC and within our own country. And then a second place where that's having a huge impact in the space that I do research in is looking at coastal resilience and thinking about how can we make communities and coastal ecosystems more resilient as we face additional levels of climate change and potentially increasing storm intensity or frequency along our coast. And so the role that natural ecosystems play, including coastal wetlands, in providing that erosion risk reduction and wave height and energy reduction, the science going on there, and this is multidisciplinary science. It's natural science, it's engineering, it's looking at landscape scale questions. That is playing a huge role in our movement towards thinking about a much more diverse approach to coastal resilience, thinking about both restoring native habitats, but also what I call hybrid approaches. So that's combining aspects of built infrastructure and natural infrastructure to provide those kinds of benefits that we're looking for. So I cannot underemphasize the role that continued science plays in our understanding of wetlands, their functions, and how we can then incorporate that into our policies, our decision making, and perhaps maybe one day we'll have a, Save Our Wetlands Act. Who knows? But even in absence of that, the science is playing a huge role in policy and decision making, which is really exciting.
I love that. So I'm going to transition a bit now towards focusing on the future and how we see things. And so how do both of you expect the role and focus of wetland science to evolve in the future? And this kind of can include anything of different pressures, of directions that it can lead to. So Ariana, do you feel
So what I think is really cool about the field of ecology and maybe more broadly sort of understanding ecosystem services, which is a technical term that basically means the benefits that people and human communities get from natural systems, which is where my research really sort of focuses today, is that we continue to discover exciting benefits that nature provides. And we are like, it's like an onion. I mean, how deep does it go, right? It's pretty exciting. So in the space where I work, as I mentioned, there's coastal blue carbon, there's natural coastal resilience, and then an even more recent and super cutting edge piece here is how nature exposure provides benefits for human health, both directly and indirectly. So I'm talking about the benefits of taking a walk outside and how that is really helpful for mental health, for example. And when I think about walking in my neighborhood, that's lovely and already a good start, but wouldn't I rather be walking on a beach next to a salt marsh? Yes, absolutely, right? So there's levels of what is our experience with nature, and wetlands can play a really important part in that restorative experience people have. In fact, some of my absolute favorite vacations have been getting to do things like kayaking through mangroves. Pretty awesome. So you've got the mental health benefits. There's really cool evidence suggesting there are physical health benefits of nature exposure as well. And this is a place where I would really love to have a chance to dive in deeper to figure out the wetland specific benefits, because there's actually almost no research in this area in terms of if you spend a bunch of time in wetlands, how does that affect your health? But there is some really tantalizing evidence that suggests there are some really cool microbes in wetland soil, which we already know, but what we don't know is how they affect human health. But there is definitely evidence that there's some diversity of microbes in wetland soils that is different than what you might get in, say, a forest or a grassland. And so trying to better understand what are those benefits of getting to dig your toes into the mud, right? And like scoop up some mud or plant something in that wetland, right? We don't really know a lot about those direct health benefits. And so Abigail, to me, what's so exciting is this is just that Pandora's box of like, oh my goodness, what's next? What we are just going to open that and keep opening those gifts as we understand all these different benefits. And there's still so much to be figured out there that anybody who's thinking like, oh, I might want to go do research in this area, absolutely. There's just more and more we can learn that then can, again, help to inform our policies and our decision-making about protecting urban green space, protecting urban blue space, protecting these coastal ecosystems or other wetlands across the country. And then also, as we said, the science to help better restore them. So there is just endless possibility here for really neat research questions that can then inform the way we are managing our wetlands and our landscapes.
Awesome. Awesome. So I did want to just rewind just a little bit because I realized I didn't make a statement about states and localities about protecting wetlands. And I did want to just say that, yes, while Clean Water Act is a little bit of a bouncing ping pong ball at the moment, there are very important state protections in place in certain states, such as Wisconsin. The state I'm in, New York State, does have its own protection program for wetlands specifically. So there are buffers there. There's important buffers. That all being said, more states do not have their own state level protections than do. But in the states where they are developed, these are very important. But okay, I just needed to say that in case I got called up by my New York State representative to clarify that. But getting back to the role and the focus of wetland science into the future, I completely agree about particularly climate change and thinking about restoration and also about this idea of human well-being. And I think, I think what's really important, and I'm drawing on what Ariana is saying, like the connection between our human well-being and the quality of the ecosystems, including wetlands, are completely linked together, but we don't know all of the different details there. And so, I completely agree. I'm very interested now in like studying if students eat a little bit of soil from a wetland, what are the benefits going to be? Okay, sorry, I'm not going to use my students as lab rats. Okay, not going to do that. But I really do see that there's a movement, particularly towards improving ecological restoration. And again, my hope is that we can scale up. I think we've been at a relatively small scale, at least in certain systems, for quite a while, and trying to think bigger here, I think, is really important to getting at how do we make these bigger changes, and how do we, and this is also going off of something that Ariana said and what we talked about at the beginning, these working wetlands. How do we work with wetlands? It's not humans outside of wetlands like looking in, but rather in the early part of European settlement, people grazed their cattle in marsh hay fields. We read about this in Aldo Leopold's book, A Sand County Almanac, right? The marsh hay. And there's still, of course, people who rely on wetlands for their livelihood, especially along the coast. But how do we get back to understanding how we can not just preserve wetlands away from humans, but how do we work with wetlands? How do we understand how wetlands, how we can foster our relationship with wetlands and how that gives us benefits as well, this reciprocal relationship that Robin Wall-Kimmerer talks about, for example, and how important that is for the future sustainability of our population. So that's what I would add here.
I love these things. No, these are all great. I'm excited to see what the future holds. You all are making me really enthusiastic and hopeful and encouraged of what's coming, even though I'm not a wetland person, but I'm very excited for what's to come with that. And so now we're at our halfway point, even though it feels like it's nothing because I'm enjoying this conversation. So what I'm gonna do is open the floor to people. If you wanna ask questions as well, you are welcome to drop it in the chat, raise your hand, things of that sort. We have a few already on the docket, and so I'm going to ask some of these in an appropriate way to see if because I don't fully know all of the knowledge when it comes to this. But the questions that we have so far, first one is, how do we get people to understand the connection between wetland conservation and reduction in flooding? And I'm wondering if you could expand it a bit more or tweak it to having a little bit of climate change in the context of climate change when it comes to wetland conservation and reduction in flooding as well.
Rachel, you want to start?
Sure. And I think I even saw this pop up in the chat, but oftentimes we talk about the way that we communicate this idea about wetlands and flooding mitigation is sponges, right? We talk about thinking about having a sponge intercepting water as it's coming down. It's going to soak it up, right? It's going to stay there and slowly leak out on the other side, right? Rather than you take away the sponge, water's just going to go straight into those waterways and create those really peak discharge levels that create a lot of erosion. And so just the simple imagery of a that sponge, I think, can be really effective. Also, just showing people the difference in the flooding graphs between wetlands, watersheds that have a lot of wetlands in them compared to those watersheds that don't. For example, in Tropical Storm Irene, there was a good example of this in Vermont, where they saw very destructive flooding in watersheds that did not have a lot of wetlands or a lower proportion of wetlands, and then relatively little flooding and destruction in areas that had higher wetland levels.
So what I want to add to Rachel's comment, which I totally agree with, is that the other thing that's really important to think about with wetlands is, I mentioned that we've degraded or destroyed a lot of our wetlands, and in many cases we've actually drained and then been brilliant enough to build on those areas. So you not only took away your sponge, but then you basically said, where that water was before, I'm going to build a big city. Isn't that a good idea? And so it's not only the connection between, if we restore wetlands, we can restore some of that flood capacity, but there's actually, and this comes back to sort of that science question, as we better understand the connectivity of wetlands on our landscape, and also just how water moves across our landscapes, we have a much better idea of why it's not a good idea to build in certain places, and that communities can be a lot smarter in the way they are planned and developed, both in terms of how to maintain and possibly restore additional wetland functionality for reducing flooding, and also just not to build in really dangerous places to begin with. And both of those combined are going to be very important approaches as we face a future with probably even more extremes in precipitation. So either drought or major storm events in places that maybe we're not used to experiencing those before. So wetlands have a role to play at either end of those extremes, providing a source of water as we have further, as we move further into drought-like conditions, and then also being that storage area that is really important during heavy events. But again, it does take this landscape perspective and being smart about it, because the last thing you want to do is be the house that is right adjacent to that wetland that then is going to flood, right? So there's stuff we have to think about here, but we have a lot of science to inform that planning and management now. So I'm actually very confident we can do a good job of this, but as a society, we have to decide that's important and that it's part of our climate resilience approach and strategy.
This is awesome. So there have been several questions around the word, which I'm sure you all can guess is blue carbon. And so how to break these into smaller chunks. Some of them, one, can you first, define what blue carbon is, because some people may or may not know. And then 2, why does it matter? And then to build on it, the final one is more about how do we actually, what are the important factors for increasing public understanding of the role wetlands have, or what they play in blue carbon as being. And so, yeah, Ariana?
Sure. So it's called blue carbon because it relates to our coasts and oceans. But to be fair, I focus on coastal blue carbon, not the ocean piece quite as much. And coastal blue carbon is not blue. This is very disappointing when I talk to kid audiences. They're like so excited I'm going to show them the blue carbon. And then I even occasionally get questions like, is there purple carbon? And I'm like, oh, that would be so cool. Maybe you can help me find the purple carbon. But no, so it's really not blue. It's brown in these coastal wetlands, because I think the reason why when we think about natural carbon sinks, if you ask, your average person who at least knows something about, climate, they're going to likely think of forests, which is totally, yes, another natural carbon sink. So totally a fair answer. But part of the reason why I think they're going to say that is that you see the majority of the carbon in a forest because it's in the trees. And so you see it, it's there. You can go hug it if you want to, right? In a coastal wetland, the majority of the carbon is not where you can see it. It's in the soils, which is why it's brown, not blue. And so for many of these systems, they have been accumulating and storing carbon for oftentimes hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Chesapeake Bay wetland in which I did my postdoc work was actually carbon dated to be about 6,000 years old. And when we cored all the way down to bedrock, it was about 5 meters down. So this is a lot of carbon that's been accumulating for a very long time. And that's what makes these ecosystems such impressive natural carbon sinks. They're very productive plant communities that shunt some of that carbon below ground. Then it's in a watered, logged environment. So you have not a lot of oxygen. And when you don't have oxygen present, decomposition slows way down. So you put a bunch of plant litter like leaves and twigs and bark, etc., and you put it in that waterlogged soil, and it just sits there essentially with very, very slow degradation. So it's actually the absolute perfect conditions to store carbon naturally. You put a lot of carbon in, and then it just sits there. So that's why these coastal wetlands are such impressive and important natural sinks, but it's also part of the reason that we haven't really talked about them until about the last decade as an important natural carbon sink, because we didn't see the carbon, so we didn't know it was there, so no one was talking about them. So part of my research efforts have literally been to try to just clarify, this is what they can do, this is what they can't do. Let's be real here. And just so everyone's clear, this is not the silver bullet for climate change. We can't just say, go restore all the wetlands and yay, we're done. We can keep polluting the atmosphere as much as we like with carbon. That is wrong. They are a piece of a multidimensional climate solution. We absolutely need emissions reductions and energy efficiency and all of that other stuff. And we also need restoration of forests and grasslands and our other ecosystems. But coastal wetlands are a piece of the solution. And so restoring and protecting and preventing the degradation of coastal wetlands is definitely a piece of the climate solution. And sorry, Rachel, that went on forever. Now it's your turn.
No, that's perfect. But see, I'm just going to talk a little bit about blue carbon and then just introduce a little bit of a different color. But I think another piece of the focus on blue carbon is that the blue carbon, or the carbon that's stored in these coastal saltwater environments, is less likely to be released as methane. And that creates, it's a little bit more complex, but it's more of like a home run, like, coastal blue carbon is, a win-win for climate change mitigation, right? We get into a little bit different when we talk about freshwater wetlands, peatland carbon, although peatlands particularly are so important in terms of a carbon storage. We're talking about twice the amount of carbon that global forests hold in terms of what our peatland soils hold. So these are very important reservoirs of carbon that we need to protect if we don't want the export of carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. but it's a little more complicated in that there is some more methane release, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. But this is what wetlands do naturally. It's not like something new that they developed. So this is part of, baseline levels of greenhouse gases. And it's important to have, I think, certainly an understanding of blue carbon and understanding the importance of those coastal wetland systems and their values. I think another side of this is also that this idea of teal carbon, which comes from a paper from Nalick and Fennessy, which is the inland wetland carbon. That's what they called it. And because the wetland area in the interior part of the United States is, so much larger than the coast, that we also need to be aware of that as important aspect about carbon storage and protecting those soils as well.
I love it. There's so many colors. Who knew we could include all of the colors of the rainbow soon enough? All right, so we're gonna switch gears a little bit. So one of the questions that we actually had was, well, I feel there's been some recent increases in attention to inherent and spiritual values of wetlands. How do we emphasize and protect these intangible values in our restoration and policy work? And do you need me to repeat said question?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So those are what we consider cultural ecosystem services, if we're going to get into the, academic-y language here. So those are the cultural benefits from natural systems. And they also include things like the ability to go and do research and to do education in these systems. And all of those are incredibly important values. I think for me, the beauty of thinking about the benefits you get from natural systems is that when you're working with any group of stakeholders, you can almost always identify at least one benefit that they value from a system. Maybe very different benefits depending on the stakeholder groups you're engaged with. So for example, if you're talking to a crowd that includes a lot of duck hunters, they have a different view of what that wetland is valuable for than the people who care about whether it's providing the appropriate habitat for the cold water fish that they want to fish, or whether it's the people like myself who said, oh, I just wanted to go hiking around it. I didn't even know that there was that cool fish there, et cetera, right? So what I love about thinking about the benefits we get from nature is that you can often find a way to connect with just about any audience, but you have to be willing to, one, listen, and I mean really listen, and try to not be like, well, that's not as valuable as my value that I get out of it, right? You have to be like, oh, they have a totally different perspective, and that's really interesting, because what it means is that if you really listen, you can actually find that there are coalitions you can build when thinking about preserving or restoring these systems near communities or in wilder areas. Either way, you can find coalitions you might never have imagined. And my blue carbon work really helped me to open up doors to find partners who were very interested in thinking about coastal wetland conservation, who had never done so before, but it was because they were very, very interested in climate mitigation and the natural climate solutions. And it didn't matter to them where that natural climate solution was going to be found, right? So that opened the door to finding new partners for working on coastal conservation efforts through the climate mitigation framework. And you can do that again, as I mentioned, with the hunting and fishing crew, or whoever it is, as long as you're open to thinking about what benefit do they care about and how can we use that to build a coalition. So, and I just find that wetlands are one of those things where you're going to find something that somebody loves about just about every single one, which is really exciting.
I love that. There's more questions when it comes to this too, more around policy-esque things. So the first question is, how do you restore wetlands if the land is not surrendered to that use? I think it boils down to regional watershed land use management policies and bucking the ever constant pressures to develop or manicure open land or parkland, especially along coasts and around growing urban centers. So what government actions are in progress, or what actions can the public take to influence these land use policies that focus on long-term rather than short-term benefits? It's a big question.
That's a big question. I guess I'll give a shot at it. in that, I think these are issues that we as voters can certainly come to the fore and can vote for people who do tend to have a longer term vision about how we want our communities to be and how our relationship with the land. But beyond that, I think, again, we need to make our voices heard, whether that's, to be part of these land use committees, for example, or I'm on, an advisory committee for a large wetland area. But basically getting involved and getting your voice heard, and to get people who represent your longer term values about a particular place in a position of power to be able to make those changes.
Yeah, and I'll add that absolutely vote every time. I don't care how small the election, vote. And make your voice heard, and then follow up and talk to those people. They oftentimes would love to hear more about your perspective and what you know. And if you're a scientist, talk to them about your science. I mean, it's great. I have found that people are very receptive to that. In addition, I think anything having to do with land use and management needs to have that forward thinking component. So get involved with your local land use, whatever it is, organization, city council, because there are decisions being made right now that are going to affect, I'm biased again, going back to the coastal wetland thing, because it's my thing. But for example, we know that with projected levels of sea level rise, one of the ways coastal wetlands have survived throughout centuries and thousands of years is to be able to do inland migration when there's little changes in the sea level, right? They move in a little bit and then, maybe we'll move back out again. And it's amazing how malleable these systems can be and can adapt to these changes. But guess what? They can only move inland if we haven't blocked their path with a road or a train track or a big city or, name your favorite development. And so there are actually opportunities, and there's a really cool paper, Ennis et al., I think is it from 2019, that really looked along the Gulf Coast at where are there opportunities where we think coastal wetlands will migrate inland with sea level rise. And then they overlaid on that, here are the already urban plans to develop along the Gulf Coast, right? So these are plans that have already been in place. Nobody's built there yet, but it is planned that in the next 50 to 100 years, there will be more urban development. And what you can see is that a ton of those overlap. And that if the development goes in, we will block the ability for those coastal wetlands to move inland. So if you're ever thinking what I do right now in my own community doesn't matter, isn't going to have, a 50 or 100 year or more long-term effect, the answer is probably no, actually it does. And decisions that are being made right now are going to affect the amount of coastal wetland loss we have in the future. And so land use planning that takes into account both current conditions and what we're expecting in the future are absolutely key to make sure that our children and our grandchildren still have coastal wetlands in the way we enjoy them today. So it absolutely matters.
And I want to add on that one. So one of the questions was, as a citizen, how do I make these projects more visible to the decision maker? For example, one place that this person is, they've seen major coastal resilience plans go underway, but a lot of them have not been giving enough attention to the wetlands as part of the plan. And so this person's not a wetland scientist or a specialist at large, but they're involved in wildlife and environmental conservation. So how do they make it more visible to the decision maker?
Well, so one, there's an awful lot of us who are very excited about wetlands. We've got several of us on the call today beyond Rachel and myself. So you could just go find your local wetland loving buddy. There are a bunch of us scattered around the world and around the US, and we could help you out. But also, it is totally always appropriate as a private citizen to have a viewpoint and to share that viewpoint. You don't have to be the scientist who has all the answers to say, I care about this wetland. I know it provides important benefits. I might not be able to lay out all the data for you, but I can find you someone who will if you need that. But basically, I care about this site and it matters to me. And here's why. And I want you to listen to me, and I want you to help me do something about it, right? You don't have to be the researcher to have an opinion and a voice and to share your concerns about decisions that are being made in your community. So please do continue to be vocal and let people know when you care about particular places or the future of particular places, because you don't have to be a scientist to do that.
I love this. Okay, so we have about 8 minutes, and I'm gonna open the floor also to encourage more conversation about the women in wetlands. So my final question is more speaking to the individual, your community, your state, regional, national, international. We know that wetlands have been degraded since the 1700s. It's been on record. So what needs to change to improve how we conserve or restore wetlands in any of those categories? At an individual level, how do you support that? At a community level and beyond? And so, Rachel, would you care to start?
Sure. I mean, I think, okay, so at all these different levels, how do we work towards this change, and how do we get there? I think at an individual level, I just think about my students in wetland ecology class when they get to see their first wetland or walk on a bog, and the connection that is built through that process is really incredible. So I think on an individual level, like if you hear something about a wetland walk, or just have a local area that you can visit, and sorry, I've been talked about, but as an individual level, just building your own connection, knowing a little bit more about these systems can help you develop that relationship. And then you can share that, right? You can share that with your friends, bring your friends, to be able to share that experience with them. Something that I always hear after I teach my wetland ecology class is, I never knew any, these things about wetlands. Like no one ever told me about all these values of wetlands. And so I guess on that end, if you do have an opportunity, learn more, be able to take a class, visit a webinar, like you're doing now, so that, just getting more information and getting more information out there. And then I think there is an important, in terms of then the steps up, I think making sure that the connection never is broken between the values that wetlands provide and our human well-being on a societal and a political basis. That doesn't get to be, like, wetlands don't get to be put back in the trash can of wastelands, because they continue to be undervalued in terms of real estate, for example, because you can't build on them. I hear this every day, okay? Like, oh, sorry, I'm missing that, but we like avoided a catastrophe by not buying that place because we couldn't build on it. It wasn't, and that narrative still exists. We know it still exists. And so continuing to make those connections between the values that wetlands provide and our societal well-being, and then also to recognize that people do hold these different opinions or whatnot about these systems, and be able to talk to people. As Ariana is saying, we don't have to be on polarized sides. There is no Democratic or Republican wetlands here, but rather that we can talk about these societal goals and how wetlands play a part in these longer term goals that we have for our communities and for our nation.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. That was beautiful. I did get to recently see a presentation by a professional photographer, which is a gift I wish I possessed, to be a professional photographer, who got to go around the world to all sorts of really amazing places, a lot of them wetlands, I will note. And he made a statement, and I'm totally blanking on his name, so I'm not going to be able to give him proper attribution, but that we love what we know, and we conserve what we love, and we love what we know. And that just really struck home with me. And so I think, to Rachel's point, the more you learn and you're engaged in your own community and you share what you love about a place, the more you're going to get other people excited about it. And, it can kind of just grow from that grassroots. Spend time in the places you love and then share them with other people. And then that will lead to other people also loving wetlands. It is actually pretty shocking how little time kids are spending in nature these days in comparison to a decade or two ago. And I know this makes me sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but there's data to back me up here, okay? So I'm not just that. But literally, kids are just not getting outside as much, whether it's to the local park or to national parks. It doesn't matter. And yet again, if we go with, we conserve what we love and we love what we know, if we're not spending time in these places, then they don't know them in the way we know them, right? And so I think the absolute best advice is to get outside, take your friends, take your family, and great things can hopefully come of that.
I love that. That is a perfect ending. So what I'm going to do is actually allow Rachel to give a little bit more about what you all do.
Okay, so I wanted to give a shout out to and a plug for an upcoming event that the Women in Wetlands section is holding at the Joint Aquatic Sciences meeting. This is often our major event that we do, is at the Society of Wetland Scientists annual meeting. But this year we're at a meeting with various other aquatic sciences societies as well. So this meeting is going to be held in Grand Rapids from May 14th to the 20th. And at these annual meetings, the Women in Wetlands section, it hosts a symposium that particularly focuses on professional development that seeks to support and promote women in the field of wetland science. And this year, it's going to be lessons on leadership and mentorship, tips and stories. And we don't have a date yet on that, but it will be forthcoming. And it'll be over the course of one day. But we have at least 11 speakers lined up for this topic. And then also at that same meeting, we are collaborating with other societies to host a luncheon called Leading for Change, How Women in Science Are Overcoming Adversities. And this will be set for Tuesday on May 17th for the lunch section there. And one of the main objectives for the Women in Wetlands section is networking. So we also host a networking event through the meeting to help bring people together and to really make those connections stronger, so that we can continue to support women in this field.
So with all that in mind, I want to thank both of our fabulous panelists today. Also, thank you to the Women in Wetlands for allowing this to happen. If you have any questions, you can definitely send either the Women's Aquatic Network an email and we'll pass it along to the Women in Wetlands, or you can also just email them yourself. I'd like to thank you all again. Happy World Wetlands Day once more.